Здравейте, драги зрители! Conscious of the risk that it may be polarizing to do, I still have to admit that, in my opinion, Mortarion is the worst Primarch. If you were about to say Lorgar, hold your horses for a bit. This sentiment is formed from two things. First, in regards to tactics and leadership, he is one of the two Primarchs whose reunion with their sons was a genuine downgrade to their legion. Moreover, he is the worst of the two, because unlike Angron, he doesn't have the excuse of murder self-deletion nails embedded in his grey matter. And second is this funny little word, which, amusingly enough, crops up quite a bit in regards to practically all of the Primarchs. Hypocrisy. A word that Mortarion is kind of an avatar for. Espouses honor, yet conducts one of the most dishonorable forms of warfare, large AoE chemical or radiation weapons. Claims to love his sons and care about their well-being, but orders them to stop using sensible military tactics and to instead basically face-tank the leftover toxic waste of their weapons together with whatever survived said weapons' use. Absolutely hates psychers and psychic stuff to the point where he, quote-unquote, keeps his legion pure of them and ruins their use for everyone else via his involvement in the Council of Nicaea, seemingly just to spite his brother and possibly to spite his father. But then, he himself is a psyker, signs on with Chaos Juiceman Horus, starts using sorcery bullshit to keep a pet demon host, and, either due to personal incompetence or sentimental weakness, allows his pure legion to be impregnated with a big chunk of magic men via his brother Typhon, all of which resulted in their putrid fate, and so on. But greatest among his hypocrisies, which we see in the Buried Dagger, has to be the following. Believes and, supposedly, enforces strength and endurance, both of body and of will, within himself and his sons. Yet in the end, at the most crucial moment that would test his resolve, what did he do?
Forced out like a bitch!
He broke. That's the long and short of it. And it just sucker punches him down to the ground character-wise for me. Lorgar, the one perceived to be the worst, may be an absolutely evil, rotten bastard, but his will never broke. His devotion was shattered when the Emperor sanctioned him and had the Ultramarines burn down Monarchia, but he never faltered in his convictions, as fucked up as they may have been. Not to mention that before he veered off into treason, the little golden choir boy was a polite diplomat who was actually pleasant to be around and talk with, even able to prevent Magnus and Russ from wrecking each other before Prospero without talking big and intentionally breathing in toxic fart gas on the regular just to prove he can take it. Even the most unstable Primarchs like Angron and Kurz endured the worst tests of mental anguish thrown at them. For the worst, yes, but that's a different point entirely. Mortarion did not. Oh, but he did it to save his sons! He was forced! He had no choice! Some would argue, but personally I don't buy it. His entire fall is honestly very disappointing. Yeah, there is the angle of the character breaking, but more so because the way it was done was way too forced in my opinion, which I go into more detail about in my review of the Buried Dagger book. As cool as this venting may be, it does also raise the question of how could it have gone differently? Because while I may not like him, I have to admit, Morty was put in a rather tough spot. Was there any way for him to get out of it while saving his sons and sticking to the way his character was established up to that point? It is something I've spent a lot of consideration on, and I believe I've come upon a positive answer. Before we delve further into it, please remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel for future uploads. Also, if you want to support the channel a little extra, you can do so with a coffee donation via the link in the description. But now, you've waited long enough. Let me present to you how I would have preferred for the fall of the Death Guard and their Reaper of Men to take place.
What do you want, my champion?
The grandfather entity's words washed through Mortarion's being as it extended its putrid hand to him. I want to endure. The answer would have been easy to give, yet the words never manifested. It made him wonder why. Was it sheer spiteful pride that halted his confession? Was he really about to let himself and his sons die such an agonizing, humiliating death over such petty feelings? Or was it simply that by this point his throat was so ravaged by the infernal plague that he was physically incapable of uttering anything? That thought brought back the awareness of his own body's internal struggle against the chimeric disease that was assaulting it, forcing open his being to the tides of the immaterium. His sensation expanded from the genetic to a more macro level, reminding him of the accursed flies that managed to get within his warplate, savaging his meat. Next to capture the Primarch's attention was the degradation of his gauntlet, which had pulled Typhus's dagger, withering away to dust, revealing the triad of pustules, the origin point of his own infection, which matched the eyes and mark of the demonic deity who craved his loyalty. Last to announce itself among the crippling pain was the mutation that struggled to reshape his form, primarily noticed by the sensation of his rebreather fusing with the flesh of his face. As if in a cruel attempt of mockery, the desperation that was sinking into the Reaper of Men briefly pulled back its claws, allowing him to finally taste it again. Barbaros's poison, vented into his lungs through the mask that hid most of his visage. Revelation dawned upon Mortarion shortly after, of what the toxic smog of his homeworld was. It was the strength of the overlords, but he was never one of them. Despite being a gene-crafted demigod, in the end he was a mortal, a human, just like the creature that used to be his first captain had said. And to humans, the fetid air that claimed the heights of Barbaros was one thing: weakness. All this time, his sons strived to never show even an inkling of it before their gene-sire, as he would consider it a betrayal. Yet he kept pumping his lungs full of it, whilst brazenly striding among them, thinking he was displaying strength, as if he were an overlord, as if he was like his adoptive father. And where did that lead him? Betrayed by the one true brother he believed he had, and those who held more loyalty to Typhus than himself, infested by a sorceress curse, groveling before some never-born creature, surrounded by the eyes of his betrayers, and his sons, dying of the same plague that brought him low, afraid of what he would need to do to protect them. Like a surging torrent, desperation was about to crash down upon him and break the dam of his will, until a familiar voice addressed him from behind.
You rejoice, Mortarion.
Typhus's tone came out as a scratching gurgle.
The grandfather himself has come to gift you rebirth and salvation for our legion. By now you must know that it is a destiny who cannot refuse. What is the point of this continued struggle? No one would think less of you for embracing the inevitable. If anything, you can be proud of how long you've held out against it.
A sickening guttural chuckle of mockery preceded his next words.
Do you think Dorn's stony demeanor would have lasted more? Or Perturabo's iron within and without? Not even the Red Angel could withstand the entropic might of our patron.
Nurgle's herald spread his arms in an inviting gesture, small clouds of the destroyer flies pouring out and back into him with the motion.
Relent. Submit. And become what you were always meant to be.
Whatever corruption was claiming the Terminus S seemingly reached a critical point as an alarm signaling some critical failure began to blare, a red light bathing the entire hangar in crimson with each horn scream. Its first blare heralded the pivot in Mortarion's psyche. Everything he had perceived, considered, remembered, and felt in these final hours sickened him more than any ailment could. A second blare. Typhus's final push manifested as the crack into the infinite void of despair that threatened to devour the Reaper of Men, which now began to rapidly fill with crimson infernal rage. A third blare.
Defiance alone is not enough,
The 14th Primarch whispered, slamming his exposed fist into the deck plating, splattering the triplet bubles that marked him.
What?
The Nurgle creature exclaimed in surprise, summoning the attention of its herald. A fourth blare. Just like the traitorous witch and his master coerced, in his fury, Mortarion chose to relent. However, not in the way they wished.
No!
Shouted the grandfather. A fifth blare.
to defeat death.
Silence's pommel also struck the floor, the weapon's shaft creaking under the tightening grip of its wielder, who finally looked up at the pestilent entity, eyes bloodshot with anger, and then gazed past it.
You must sacrifice!
A sixth blare. Time and moment, past and present, the structures of them crumbled and turned into sand, smothering Mortarion in the Elswen. He was there on Barbarous, and it was decades gone, and he was here in the utter insanity of the Immaterium. Together and separated, divided and merging. His father, the Emperor of Mankind, his would-be patron, the Lord of Decay, Nurgle, had both beckoned to him, offering Mortarion what he could not refuse. His oath and his honor forbade him from taking any other path from this moment forward. He had sworn to bend the knee to the stranger at the lodge if he could not defeat the High Overlord, and he had vowed to protect his legion beyond all else. A seventh blare.
No, he is mine! Begone!
Screamed the manifestation of the Lord of Decay.
Stop him!
Typhus shouted at his remaining grave wardens and the several mutated legionaries that had embraced their new patron, whilst his clawed hand shot towards the Primarch. Upholding oath and honor. Lofty, but by now pointless ideals, at least for the Reaper. Who was he to strain to uphold them? At long last, he came to terms with what he was. He was already an oathbreaker, a betrayer, betrayed, a liar, a creature capable of using the powers of the warp, no different than his father, something he hated, simply damned, and he had had enough of it. He would dance and act to the tune of others no more. From henceforth, the only thing he would break would be his enemies. Under the effects of the Destroyer Plague and the surging Empyrean, every pore of his psychic being had been opened, and he focused it all to look beyond the suffocating ambush he was in. If the sickness that could bring him and his legion low was born of the Immaterium, then a strength potent enough to counteract it must also be found there, he reasoned, as all of his will expanded and bellowed upon the baleful tides of unreality to bring him what he desired. And through the deafening, buzzing cacophony of the plagued bastards, one unfamiliar, commanding voice introduced itself for the first time, eliciting the truest pledge to ever come from Mortarion's being.
Endower the strength to break this false destiny, and all of my sons, all of my soul, will forever spill crimson in your name!
Rusted blades and putrid talons rent past their Genesire's warplate, sinking into his back, sending globules of his vitae to coat the deck and a handful of fallen Death Guard that still struggled against the illness. For an instant, Typhus may have felt the joy of success, believing that his patron's puppet was assured, but it was dashed when it came. The 8th blare of the alarm. It extended unceasingly, drowning all in red, and seemingly banished the Plague God's avatar. With a single sudden jerk of motion, the Lord of the 14th scattered the assailants from himself, before rising and turning around to glare fire at the stunned herald of Nurgle.
Never again shall I taste weakness!
Mortarion declared as he grabbed his rebreather, partially crushing it, before yanking it away with the sickly wet tear of his lower face, leaving his bleeding meaty skull exposed. For some reason, to the Barbaran's shock, his brother's visage remained as such, showing no sign of his superhuman healing trying to fix it. Even more concerning was the fact that his form began to grow as he now stomped forward. 2 of the Grave Wardens that had regained their footing charged the Primarch, but in mere heartbeats, silence danced invisibly through the air, imperceptible even to someone as blessed as Typhus, turning the pair into gory chunks. Brief distraction came to the mutated half-breed when he noticed something in his eye's periphery. The Death Guard, who had been sprayed with their Genesire's blood, even if by just a drop, were rising from their plagued stupor, their signs of sickness seemingly burning off from their flesh, and they were falling upon the rest of their corrupted kin, butchering them mercilessly. All the while, gradually, the rest of the other legionaries began doing the same, somehow overcoming the chimeric illness, and it was not isolated to this hangar. Typhus could feel this second wind made of flame and fury spreading throughout the fleet through the culling of those touched by the grandfather. It would all crescendo into fearful sweat breaking over his corpulent skin when he heard Mortarion's voice again, returning his gaze to see bone and sinew burst from his bulging protean form's back wound, coating itself with leather to form 2 muscular draconic wings that sank him in shadow as the Primarch spoke and advanced.
Stone erodes and cracks, iron rusts and bends, and like that pathetic, weakling and gone, I will not be broken.
His reddening skeletal visage bellowed, guttural might now surging in place of the tortured wheezing that had once existed in the creature's throat. His steps melted imprints in the floor's plating, and his war scythe, also enlarged to match its wielder's new frame, swung upwards with a windy roar.
I swore to destroy every last overlord of Barbarous. I will not suffer the final one to breathe any longer.
Desperation found a new victim in the half-breed. Reason banished, driven entirely by instinct, he screamed at the approaching behemoth.
How dare you! This was not our destiny!
Unleashing torrents of flies from every orifice of his body to devour Mortarion, along with every diseased force his own psychic might could conjure. Through sheer volume, they were able to blunt his advance, momentarily fooling Typhus into a smile. It would fade as quickly as it manifested when the cloud of insects began bursting into liquid. Silence sang through the air, shredding swaths out of the cloud, resulting in thick tendrils of goopy sick to splatter on the floor as he continued to ceaselessly press forward. Suddenly, a disturbing detail graced the Barbaran's perception. A red mist was forming around the scythe. As it drew closer, he was able to see that it was not mere mist. With each swing, Silence let the flies' fetid bodies fall, but as it cut their lives short, it dragged off whatever minuscule amount of blood was present in them, causing it to swirl like a river around itself and its wielder, which somehow protected him from the psychic barrage. This only continued for mere moments before an even more terrifying revelation dawned upon him. He could no longer feel any insects within his hollowed-out form. Before he could process it any further, a massive crimson backhand embedded his Terminator bulk into a nearby wall. A gasp for air turned into a raspy gag from the holes in his flesh, preceding him looking up to meet the burning gaze of the Primarch's towering, monstrous form.
How?
Typhus coughed out.
Creatures like you should be susceptible to the touch of the arcane.
Surprisingly, he would receive a response.
I am strength incarnate, beyond petty witchcraft.
Mortarion's tone was eerily even as he hefted silence with both hands.
Flowing through my sons.
No other venerators of Nurgle remained, leaving the handful of blood and viscera-covered Death Guard to surround them, watching in muted rage.
And as you are no son of mine,
the war scythe once more loomed upwards.
You are unworthy of my blood!
A thought of protest wanted to manifest itself, but before its impulse could venture out of the half-breed's brain and reach his mouth, his head and the hangar's wall section were cleaved with a single mighty swing. In its path, silence drank every last bit of vitae that was left in the Barbaran, leaving his rotten corpse to mulch and dissolve from the various other oozes and juices that remained in it, while the horned head was near instantly dried to the bone as it hit the floor, never to reform the being it belonged to. His killer picked it up by the unnatural horn growth and lifted it high for the rest of his sons to see, then commanded,
Weakness is treason. Neither will ever be permitted to exist with us.
He then set the unnatural skull upon his chest, nestled in the core of the massive curved rune that formed upon his brass-turned battle plate.
We are done lingering in this place. Ursa's orders can wait. We shall ensure that the Manji Wolves accomplish their task. All ships, follow me.
With those words, the muscular wings flexed, and in a single swipe, Mortarion flung himself into the churning warp, beginning to blaze like a surging pyre, which his fleet would sail after. On that day, the Reaper of Men would die, as he was destined, and from the top of his brass citadel, a god of war would laugh in grim satisfaction as his champion was reborn and baptized in slaughter, with his sons carving his name into the Immaterium with their shout, "Hail the Red Reaper!" Well, how many of you saw that coming? Best part has got to be that it's not that far-fetched of a possibility to have happened. A fan of the Death Guard had asked me how could Khorne want them, considering they don't fight in a way he likes, and why would he intervene against Nurgle in the first place? Valid questions that I'm sure some of you have thought of as well. For the first, there is the fact that Khorne does not care from where the blood flows, only that it does. Your average soup kitchen volunteer doesn't really do anything Khorne would like, but if he were to suddenly decide to dedicate himself to the Blood God and change his ways, Big Red won't reject his contributions to his furniture. Not to mention the time when Khorne tried to get Rogel Dorn on his side via not really coordinate means, such as manipulation. If he's willing to break his own rules in that regard, then making an exception for someone off of the angle that they get overtaken by absolute unyielding rage, which still carries great benefits for him, a Primarch and a Legion under his thrall, is not beyond the pale. As for the latter, it is important to remember that the Chaos Gods all hate each other. Warring with the rest via infinite demonic armies is what they call their Great Game, which is going on to this day in the lore. They only ever paused it to deal with the Emperor's rise against them, but that did not make them friends, or even anything close to it. Whenever possible, so long as it didn't lead to the failure of their overall goal of subduing the anathema, they would fuck with one another without a doubt. Rather than spending more time on the "would Khorne do it" question, I'd rather pivot to the benefits of Mortarion having such a crash-out to spite his fate. For starters, he would retain his character of being an unyielding bastard, both physically and mentally. Not having that shameful moment of giving up preserves the integrity and sympatheticness that his backstory set up, while also making him more inspiring for actually enduring and overcoming a heavy burden where the deck was legitimately stacked against him. Finally, coming to grips with his own inadequacies, acknowledging them, and pushing forward, on the other hand, acts like a redemption for the frankly unpleasantly cringy behavior he exhibits earlier throughout the series. And best of all, taking this pivot makes him an excellent narrative tool to explore a couple of things that do exist in the lore, but almost never get any kind of spotlight. Coordinate Psychers, for example. Yes, Khorne despises magic, but psychic power isn't magic. A Psyker can become a sorcerer and have an easier time with it, but not all sorcerers are Psychers. Psychic power is something one is innately born with, so it is considered a personal talent that can be trained and perfected by natural means, something that the Blood God respects and encourages in his followers. Mortarion is, in my mind, the perfect vector to show that, since his hatred of witchery matches that of his new patron, and even if he accepts his nature, he wouldn't really be that flashy about it, rousing his own blood within his followers to strengthen them enough to fend off disease, or siphoning the blood of slain enemies to empower himself. But the even bigger thing that is usually missing from the lore is beef, specifically between Khorne and Nurgle. As previously mentioned, all of the Chaos Gods absolutely hate each other, and their conflicts are pretty well defined. Tzeentch and Slaanesh being the respective opposites of Nurgle and Khorne, then the Blood God hating the Architect of Fate for being the god of magic, while the Grandfather and the Prince of Pleasure come into conflict over one side dulling all sensation and the ownership of the Eldar goddess Isha, and also the Schemer and the Temptress engaging in bouts of mutual subterfuge, be it for pleasure, knowledge, or simple supremacy. But I haven't really been able to find examples of the Butcher and the Plague Lord having more specific and tangential points of conflict. Having one steal the toy of the other is a great piece in that regard. And as a cherry on top, this happening would have been a great plot twist and subversion of expectations, given how thick the blatant "he goes to Nurgle" foreshadowing was smeared on Mortarion's character and Legion. Now, some of you might say that Khorne wouldn't have been able to overcome Nurgle in this instance. I disagree. For centuries, the Great Crusade was raging through the galaxy, and now the heresy was burning it to an even greater scale. In this time period, the happenings of the material plane are majoritively in favor of Khorne being empowered. Then there is the matter of Mortarion himself. While not the most potent among his brothers, he is still a Primarch who comes to terms with his psychic gifts after being forced to do it from the Destroyer Plague, mixed in with Typhus and Nurgle's machinations. And as the scene in The Buried Dagger, which the rewrite was of, has them sitting in the warp, bulkheads and doors open, Geller fields down, an environment in which the Plague Lord could manifest an avatar in front of the Reaper of Men, it stands to reason that he would be able to establish contact with a different power of the Materium if he put his focus to it. At which point, you have a Primarch's soul and a significantly bigger number of followers than those who sided with Typhus, accepting the Blood God. Under those circumstances, I am fully convinced that Nurgle's influence would have been overcome in favor of Khorne. But what do you guys think? Have I managed to convince you of the validity of this train of thought, or have I missed some crucial detail? Did you enjoy the narrative, and would you be interested in seeing more similar reimaginings of the lore, possibly forming an alternative view of the heresy as a whole? I would absolutely love to read all of your thoughts in the comments below. For now, this concludes Death Guard March, and begins the preparations for Emperor's Children April. Be sure to look forward to this exquisite lineup. Until next we meet, I wish you a lovely rest of your day. Doviždane.